and welcome to the Hunger Trap podcast. I'm Lisa,
I'm Diana.
and we're here to talk about all things eating disorders, disordered eating, and body image.
Before we get into it, just want to give you a little disclaimer. We're not healthcare providers, we're not psychologists. We're just talking about our personal experiences with eating disorders and body issues to let others know they are not alone in their struggles.
And also, if you are currently seeking eating disorder treatment, please be aware that we speak candidly often about food and weight. And if you're in the middle of, if you're struggling right now, you may want to turn this off and come back to us when you're feeling up to it and better. So, Diana, last time we chatted, we had kind of an emotional episode for both of us where we were, it was hard, right? That was a really hard one.
Yeah.
We talked about and we spoke to several different, mostly women, about what they felt like, what was going through their heads, and what they felt like when they would say out loud or think to themselves, I feel fat. And we got so many emotional responses from people. And it kind of was inspired a little bit by something that happened with me with my 9-year-old daughter one morning when she was kind of going through this very difficult morning, just feeling like she didn't like her clothes. She didn't, things just weren't feeling good for her that morning. And she said out of nowhere, I feel fat. And in talking with her about that a little more, and of course, I was upset and shocked by this and didn't know how to respond. I had flashbacks of my own eating disorder, and I want to protect her from that. But in talking to her about that a little bit, I realized that she didn't really know what she was saying. She didn't really understand. She wasn't saying it the way an adult woman might say it. She had like a lot of feelings, and that was something that came out of her. It was something she heard. It was something she maybe thinks is acceptable to say. She didn't really quite understand the weight of what she was saying. And I guess we should stop and mention, because again, we forget to introduce ourselves often. Diana and I have been friends for a few years now, but we grew up in the same neighborhood, went to the same high school, and later on as adults realized that we actually have shared experience of eating disorders. So I developed anorexia at about 11, 12, and have been in recovery for it. I want to say for a good 10 years since I've been like in true recovery for it, but it's still a struggle. You still have thoughts and you still have to work on it a lot.
Yep.
And Diana?
And I was put on my first diet when I was 8 years old, and have struggled with disordered eating, compulsive overeating, a very bad self body image, and have been anywhere from just, overweight to morbidly obese throughout my life. And so I'm just constantly, dealing with as I call it, the dark companion on my shoulder when it comes to my relationship with food and my relationship with my body.
Right. So one thing we didn't have time to get into last episode, and it really deserves its own episode, is how do we feel when we hear children say, I feel fat?
Hmm.
Diana, you had a lot of your friends respond to you about how
Right.
it made them feel.
Yeah. So we got some good responses, and I think the overall, like the overarching theme to their responses was like sadness and pity. I had one person respond that says, when a child says, I feel fat, and she was talking about her own children, I make a great effort to keep my face and tone neutral and say, what does that mean to you? Is it a feeling in your body, or are you talking about the way you look? And then we drill down about and talk about body size, how they're growing, how food supports our health and energy, and whether we may need to move more, or up our 5 a day fruits and vegetables. But we never talk about calories or denying foods. And I make a point to talk about fatness in a neutral way in a regular conversation. And I feel like that was a beautiful response. The other people who responded, it was more like, when I do hear this, I feel bad for them. I wish I was raised with a positive body image, or at least some healthy habits around food. Um, you know, things like that. So, once we read these, we knew we had to talk about this on its own episode, and we definitely, needed to bring in an expert to help us, right?
Absolutely, because we
Yeah.
don't know what we're doing. We're struggling with this every day. So we're so happy to welcome Our special guest, Oona Hansen, who is a parent coach who has been in education for over 20 years. She loves supporting families as they navigate the challenges of adolescence. She's passionate about helping parents raise kids who have a healthy relationship with food and their body. Oona runs the public Facebook page Parenting Without Diet Culture, and her writing and workshops focus on fostering body image resilience and lowering the risk for eating disorders. Una holds a master's degree in educational psychology and a master's degree in English, and her work has been featured widely, including on CNN, Today, Good Morning America, U.S. News and World Report, Grown and Flown, Pop Sugar, Your Teen, and Maria Shriver's Sunday Paper. So, Una, welcome. Una's joining us from Los Angeles, where she lives with her husband and her two children. And her website, which, and we'll give you more details at the end of this, but her website is, if you want to look her up, www.unahanson, OONAHANSON.com. Una, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I've really been looking forward to this.
Great.
So,
So, we want to dive right in. Diana, you had a
no.
burning question.
Okay, so one of the first questions we had were what are some of the red flags that parents should look out for with children that suggest an unhealthy relationship with food?
It's a great question because I think parents often have an idea of what an eating disorder looks like, and so they may not always know to be worried. So I think it's a really important question. The overarching thing I will say is that how your kids eat is a lot more important than what they eat. So, kids can be selective eaters. They can go through phases of not liking certain things. And I don't want any parent to panic that, you know, something is like horribly wrong. It's really important to focus on, their attitude. Are they relaxed around meals? Or is there a lot of anxiety? Are they reading food labels? That's a big red flag.
Mm.
Mm,
Because a lot of times kids are taught in school. Like there've been a lot of school assignments, even over Zoom, where go get your cereal, bring the cereal box in. Let's look at how many grams of sugar. And obviously, these are very well-meaning teachers, and a lot of these assignments are dictated by state health education curriculum decisions that aren't in the teacher's hands. But so a lot of kids can kind of start to fixate on food facts or get really into the weeds on nutrition, which is just not appropriate for kids.
mm,
So if you, as a parent, if you notice your child, obsessively reading food labels, that's definitely cause for concern. I would get support for that. Affect anyone. So Diana, you're not off the hook having a boy, and I know we've talked about that. I'm
yes.
sorry. um, so eating disorders affect boys and girls. It doesn't matter what their body size is, their gender identity. They're actually, kids who identify as LGBTQ are actually at higher risk for eating disorders.
Mhm.
Um, and it's not just the rich white teen girl stereotype that we saw in the after school specials when we were kids.
Mm-hmm.
And
Tracy
so
Gold. Yeah.
Yep.
right. So it's really important that we just kind of have it as something that we would keep an eye on. So I think it's a really good question. I mean, there's so many other things. If you notice your child, let's say, cutting their food into really teeny tiny pieces, um, if you notice your child eating quickly, guzzling a big drink of water, and then running to the bathroom and not coming back for a while, long showers after meals. Um, there are a lot of food behaviors that you'd want to kind of, if you feel that oh feeling, listen to it.
Mm.
It doesn't mean anything is dire, right? But I think a lot of us think, oh, if this doesn't look like an eating disorder, it must be fine. So I think the biggest challenge, I realize I'm going on and on. The biggest challenge, I think, is because in our current culture, a lot of kids think they're doing things out of health, right? So you
Mhm.
might have even a preteen say, I really want to eat healthier, right? And the messages out there about what healthier means can really quickly turn into orthorexic and even anorexic behaviors, and they can get really, really sick pretty fast. So it's not always that a kid says, I don't like the way my body looks and I want to change that. It could very easily start for boys or girls with just an attempt to eat healthier, or a child decides to go vegetarian or vegan, or they heard they should go gluten free, or, oh, my favorite baseball player went dairy free and his batting average went up. I mean, it can
Oh.
start so innocently, right? So I think that's something to watch out for. Any drastic change in your child's eating, cutting out any food groups, definitely those are some red flags.
Una, that actually leads into my second question pretty well, because I think one of the things, Diana, that you and I do sometimes on this podcast is we just assume that everybody knows what all of the different eating disorders are because we're very well versed in them. So, Una, you had an article for Medium entitled What You Know About Anorexia is Probably Wrong. And you talk about how one major eating disorder myth is that, quote, anorexia is the main eating disorder. Like, I know if I poll a bunch of my mom's friends, for example, they may be able, I mean, they'll know what anorexia is. They may know a little bit about bulimia, but I think that parents mistakenly believe maybe if their child isn't restricting food, that they're okay. So, can you, for people who don't know, talk about some of the other eating disorders that are prevalent in young people and just some signs of them? And you mentioned orthorexia, which is, Diana and I will have a lot to say about that in subsequent podcasts, but
Hmm.
I don't think maybe people even know what that is.
Right. So let's start with orthorexia. I actually wrote a piece about this for Your Teen magazine. I can send you that link if you want to include that.
Hmm.
Uh, Orthorexia is the unhealthy obsession with healthy eating. And it's not in the DSM-5, but it looks like it might get included in the future. I think there's a push to have that included because it overlaps significantly with anorexia. Um, and basically, when someone becomes obsessive about, eating clean, eating healthy, eating perfectly, uh, it can really take a kid down a restrictive path. So that's one that I'm hearing about more and more from families, that something starts out as, a sort of a health kick, right? Like,
Mm.
in January, obviously we're recording this in December, but, January, there will be a lot of ads out there for, detoxing and cleansing after the quarantine, slide or whatever, all the awful
Hmm.
things that we've been hearing about. And so, I think, we really want to keep an eye on that. Now, again, disclosure, I'm not a medical provider either. I'm not an eating disorder treatment provider. Um, so just put that disclaimer out there. If people need resources, obviously they can reach out to me and I can point them in the right direction. But you're right, anorexia is sort of the most visible. Those of us who grew up in the 80s, we had Karen Carpenter as sort of the poster child for what we think anorexia looks like. Bulimia is getting a little more popular attention, especially because of the show The Crown, because Princess Diana struggled with bulimia, and they actually address it somewhat in the show. But you're right; those are kind of the most well known. Binge eating disorder, um, is what it sounds like. Someone who has, uncontrollable, kind of overwhelming desire to eat, beyond the point of comfort. And all the eating, and those aren't all the eating disorders. There's, ARFID. There's so many other eating disorders. Really selective eating. So ARFID is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So a child who, has either sensory issues or other reasons why they have a really, really limited ability to eat can develop ARFID.
Hmm.
And there are others as well. And of course, even anorexia has subtypes. So there are restricting type anorexia. There's also binge purge type anorexia. So a lot of these kind of blend together. And I think the really, like, the root of this for parents is to remember that all eating disorders stem from restriction. So, um, no matter what the eating disorder is, the cause or the root cause of the disordered behavior and all the symptoms and the health problems, it starts with restriction.
Yeah, I think if I may just interject, I just want to go back to the red flags. Another red flag could be if your child is hiding food in their room due to restriction. They're feeling restricted in at meals or restricted from snacks, and therefore they're hiding food in their room so they could eat later because they're hungry.
Mm.
Yes, I hear about this a lot. People say, I'm finding candy wrappers under my son's bed, or I found all this food my daughter had stolen out of the cupboard. Yeah, definitely. If kids are feeling restricted, many of them will find very clever ways of getting their needs met. So it's actually like that the kid's body is doing what it needs to do, right? They're feeling restricted or ashamed about their appetite or their food choices. Foods that we make off limits create that forbidden fruit mentality, right? So, if we think, oh, we can't have candy bars in the house, and so we never allow them, the minute they're available, it makes sense that a child or an adult would, want to almost hoard them, right?
Right.
Um, so I think also on the hiding food, if you ever find a child is pretending to eat, but is actually, putting it in their napkin or feeding it to the dog, like beyond what a normal kind of
Hmm.
giving a dog food to, if people give their dog people food, but if you ever were to find, like they're hiding food to pretend that they've eaten it, that's another huge red flag.
Okay, I'm trying to think of like a good way to bridge this, but I mean, so so you could have a child, right, that approaches you proactively and openly and says that they want to diet. Like, so what do you say when your child? So we have these kind of behaviors that are red flags that we talked about that you may observe, but you may have your child actually come to you and say, Mom, Dad, I would like to start dieting, and how are we to handle that? Because it's hard because we don't live in a bubble, and so you could have the healthiest relationship with food in your house, but they're going to be exposed to ideas and attitudes on the internet and in social media, right? So how do
Right.
we
And their
handle that?
favorite, yeah, their favorite TikTok star might be showing them, here's what I eat in a day. Or,
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
they probably aren't going to if they call it a diet, that would be interesting to me. Um, because now, diet, everybody knows diets don't work, right? So they've all rebranded, right? They're cleanses or lifestyle resets or
Right.
detoxes, or things that are marketed to boys and men are often called biohacking or performance optimizers, or it's kind of amazing how clever diet culture is, right? It finds ways to kind of stay relevant.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So, if a child were to say, I want to start a diet, I would actually be kind of surprised. But they might say, I heard Noom is really cool, or I want to try this cool thing where this thing called IF, right? Intermittent fasting, or um, I don't want to eat X, Y, or Z anymore. But no
Right.
matter
I
what
want to.
they say, if they come to you, I mean, that's actually amazing that they're coming and talking to you about it. And I think it's always best to come at kids with compassion and curiosity, right? Even though inside, especially, when you have a history of an eating disorder, you can catastrophize really quickly, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh my God, this is the beginning of the end. Here we go. So kind of acknowledging that, like maybe you need to like take a deep breath and then talk to your kid, keep the conversation going. Like, tell me more. Like, oh, why? Where'd you hear about that? So take it slow. It kind of like Lisa when your daughter said, I feel fat, how your instinct was like to rush in and say, I think you were, like most people would want to say, no, honey, you're beautiful.
Yeah.
And you caught yourself, right? I mean, that's great because I think the default mode is that we kind of rush in and say something that ends up sending, maybe a confusing message to our kids. So,
Hmm.
yeah, so if a child comes to you wanting to make big changes, I think you just start with asking them questions without making it the Spanish Inquisition. It doesn't have to be like they're under attack, but you want to obviously express your concerns. Um, and if your child really wants to make changes, there are kids who want to go vegetarian you know for animal welfare reasons. Um, I think it's important to get really educated. If you have the access to the resources, I think an anti-diet dietitian can be really helpful in that situation to make sure your child is getting what they need and they understand how to really take care of themselves. So yeah, definitely if you ever are working with a dietitian, it has to be a health at every size anti-diet dietitian. Otherwise, even if the dietitian is giving you sort of body positive, food positive advice, if you're in a waiting room or on a website where there's like weight loss plan stuff, like that's not where, if you're listening to this podcast, that's not where you want to be.
Yeah.
I want to skip my my question about moms for a minute, and I'm going to get back to it because it's a burning one. But if our children approach us with questions and they know that we have a history with disordered eating or we're overweight, how do we handle it then? So, like, for example, well, let me ask you, like, should I be honest with my child about my own eating struggles? How honest should you be about your own eating struggles? And what happens if they kind of see through you, or they know that you have issues with food and they don't trust your advice because they don't trust the way that you handle food?
Right. That's okay. There's a lot to unpack there.
That's a lot, yeah.
The first thing I actually want to just take a step back and say that I actually don't use that O word, the quote unquote overweight word. It comes from the medical literature where these arbitrary BMI cutoffs. Um, and obviously, anybody is free to use the terms that apply to themselves. But in my house and with the families I work with, we don't use what we call the O words, quote unquote obesity or quote unquote overweight, um, because they're very stigmatizing.
Mm-hmm.
And, over what, right? Like who's deciding, what this over word means. And obesity, it sounds like a very neutral medical term, right? People will say, oh, it's just a medical definition. But it's based in a lot of bias, right? It's based in some flawed science, some very biased approaches. BMI was never designed to be a measure of individual health. Um, and, pathologizing someone's body size, like saying that because of the way your body looks, you must have a disease. Like that's not a message that I want to send our kids. And so that idea of overweight, it's really sort of like over, the sort of arbitrary, decision about what we want. We want everybody's bodies to fit into some narrow range, and that just doesn't make any sense. Like human beings have always come in a wide range of sizes, and so to label someone that they're over, like you don't fit in, the system is very flawed. So I just want
Mm,
to start with that because I think and it still strikes me now if I'm reading a novel, right, where a character is described as, being so many pounds, so-called overweight. It's like it takes me out of that book because to me it's showing that person's, um, kind of unconscious bias, right? So, but again, if people want to use that word to describe, everyone gets to decide how they want to identify. Um, but that's just a term that I'm not comfortable using around kids.
mhm.
Um, so your question about if you have an eating disorder history, do you disclose? Obviously, every case is going to be different. Your mileage may vary, but I would say you'll probably know when that moment comes and it makes sense to disclose to your child that, look, this is something I really struggled with. I don't want you to struggle with this. I want to give you all the support you need because kids are so smart. So they, you know, they might know from things people have said to you, even when they were little and they were playing in the other side of the room, right?
Yeah.
They pick things up over time. And the things that are unsaid are actually much scarier to kids than when we just call it out and say, I had this illness that's called an eating disorder, and the kind of eating disorder I had was called anorexia because I wasn't eating enough food. And I want to really make sure you always get enough food. So you can
Yeah.
do it whatever the developmental level is for your kid. But I think taking the stigma out of it and the secrecy out of it is really powerful. It's like there's this elephant in the room, just like call it out, right? Again, when it's the right time. And I think every family has you make your own decision about when that right time is, because there is a genetic component. So you also want to give your kids, just as you might, let's say if there's a history of substance abuse, right, and addiction in your family, as your kids head into the teen years, I think it's very important to share with them, look, you're at higher risk for something really serious. It's important for you to know your health risks.
So I think, Lisa, I think she answered your question, but I kind of wanted to put a follow up to this question because I know the person who asked the original question, and she has a daughter who's a preteen, and or a teen actually now, I believe. And the person who asked the question is somebody who has struggled with her size. Am I allowed to say the F word? Can I say fat? Is that okay?
I
She's
mean,
fat.
yeah, if
Yeah,
she, you know,
she's
fat is
fat.
a neutral descriptor. Fat
Yeah.
is a neutral descriptor. It can be used as an insult, certainly has many times still to this day. But it's not this like F word that we have to be so afraid of. Like there's no shame in fatness. Like that's just a natural way of being in our world, but it's been stigmatized.
I mean,
Yeah,
I would love to live in this world that you're talking about. I just don't live there because I'm
right.
fat. And I can tell you that most people don't have the attitude that you have about fat. And I know where this person was coming from. Her daughter was turning around and saying to her, "Well, I'm not going to, her daughter wants to go on a diet."
Mm,
And you know my friend is saying you don't trying to steer her away from restrictive eating, and she's turning around and saying to her like, well, what do you know about it? You're fat. And that's, I mean, that's an attitude that that we have in our society, that if a person is fat, they clearly don't know how to quote unquote eat healthily, or all they ever do is eat Taco Bell like 24/7. I mean, I've had myriad comments thrown in my own direction about what I eat, what I don't eat. People being completely shocked to see me eating a salad. I'm like, what exactly do you think I eat? So I think, how do we? So how would you guide a fat person whose child is coming to them and basically saying to them, I don't want to be fat like you, so I'm not going to take your eating advice.
right. And I would say I'm saying this as someone in a relatively smaller body, so I don't have that lived experience of
Right.
being, moving through the world and being mistreated, and judged because of the way I look. Obviously, you really never know what anybody eats or does for exercise based on how they look. It's our culture that has, told us. It's like doctors often don't ask thin patients what their food and exercise are, right? They just make the assumption.
Yep.
Um, and so, I think um, there's a lot for this mom to unpack. I think the daughter's desire to diet obviously is coming from the very things you're talking about, the kind of public abuse that people in larger bodies face every day in this world, right? So, if any child who feels like they're going to be different, teased, bullied, not get asked to the prom, whatever the thing that they're most worried about, um, they're going to want to try to change themselves to fit in, right? That's like a natural instinct. So I think the mom approaching it from a place of compassion, like, yeah, in our world, it makes sense that you'd want to diet, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with you for wanting to change yourself in a world that's saying the way you are isn't okay. Um, Now, that doesn't mean that you actually have to change, right? It's acknowledging the impulse or the desire to fit in. Like that's really strong, especially in the teen years.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think just acknowledging that desire, and from a scientific standpoint, diets are actually much more likely to cause weight gain. So, and there's nothing wrong with weight gain, in itself. That's just a part of life. Our weight tends to go up as we age. It goes up and down during different phases of life. But, for a child who's, afraid of weight gain, it could be a way in. I mean, you're not unpacking their like inner weight stigma, but to talk to them, look, here's the science, right? Like if diets worked, wouldn't Oprah Winfrey be thin by now, right? If right, like right? I
Well,
mean,
yeah,
she
if you had all the money in the world,
right.
right,
You'd
and
have all the
diets
money in the
worked.
world, and you have all the money in the world, and every personal trainer and chef and everything, therapist, everything that you could ever possibly have. I mean, Oprah has that, right? And she's naturally in a larger body, right? Like many people. In fact, we think about the images our kids see, um, kind of like what you talked about in a prior episode about, the very slender models that are, so often used. That's about like less than 1% of the human population looks like the ideal, image that we see. But really, like, you know, there's very few people can even, shop in a regular clothing store. Like the average size woman is a plus size, right? Which is like, that doesn't even make sense, right? How is the average like already outside of what we consider normal?
So Una, when I was in ED therapy, every single time I've ever seen a therapist, I would say within the first session, definitely by the second, they want to unpack everything about my relationship with my mom. And, they'll go through various questions. Did your mom diet? Did your mom have poor body image? Did she talk to you about your body? And most of the time, I have to say that she really didn't she didn't do those things. She didn't diet. My dad was the one who dieted, but my dad rarely came into the conversation. They really wanted to focus on my mom. And based on the questions we got from some of Diana's friends, from some women I've spoken with, it really does feel like mothers feel responsible for their kids, especially their daughter's body image. So I wanted to ask you why you think moms are held to this standard, and do you see it changing? Do you see fathers getting more involved, or how can fathers get more involved in helping boost their child's body image?
Right. Oh, so much good stuff. So, I mean, it's not just body image where moms are seen as like the default point person, right? I think it's part of a larger cultural issue, the way women are, you know, seen as like, if a school has there's a problem at school, who do they call first? The mom, right?
Yeah.
So, this self-perpetuating myth that moms are the better parent. It's a problem for moms and dads and kids, right? So it's a whole nother like um, line we could go down. But I think with eating disorders in particular, because of just sort of the way human beings feed babies, right? If you breastfeed, like the mother is the first feeder, even just while you're pregnant, right? You're feeding your baby. And so, mothers really get associated with that kind of like that role. And even, if a child's bottle fed, there's always the jokes of like the dad with the diaper bag and the bottle, right? Like that's somehow noteworthy, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
um, so dads can kind of get pushed out of the feeding sphere really early. So it makes sense that a lot of these therapists might jump to those conclusions. I think a big part of it though is there were a lot of books written about mothers causing disordered eating. Just like there used to be theories about cold mothers caused kids to have autism, or there were all these theories that were not based in science, right? Um, and so I really I feel for your mom, because I think a lot of mothers really are kind of blamed and shamed when their child has an illness like this. So it's important to remind all the parents out there that parents do not cause eating disorders. There are plenty of people whose parents, just bullied them about their bodies and food shamed them and all that, and they're fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can have kids from where food and body was never an issue, and they develop a serious eating disorder. Now, that being said, I think parents can help lower the risk for their kids, because we can give our kids a lot of information and kind of a safe harbor from the messages in the world. And parents can get informed, like the questions you asked at the beginning about kind of what to look out for. Um, so I think dads can play a really important role. If you have if there's a dad in your child's life, they do play a really important role in having positive eating experiences, in knowing that they're loved unconditionally, just the way a mom would send that message.
Diana, if you don't mind, I'd love to skip down to one of our listeners' questions
I was
because
just going to say that,
it's
actually.
it ties right into this. So Una, one of Diana's friends wrote in, I have 5-year-old twin girls. I am not actively trying to lose weight these days and just maintaining long-term weight loss. I work out just about every day, but I also count macros and have for a while. I started it because of CrossFit and I like doing it. The girls are starting to notice the weighing and measuring of food, and that sometimes I adjust when I'm eating for dinner versus everyone else. My husband definitely doesn't do this stuff, and he does not work out and maintains a pretty normal weight. I talk to them a lot about feeling better when I eat more vegetables or do my workout. Despite that talk, am I sending a bad message with my actions? And if so, is there a better way to go about it while still working on my own goals?
I have so much compassion for this mom, because she's trying to take care of herself, right, in the way that feels good to her. But that oh feeling, right, that red flag is going up for her. That like, ooh, my kids are seeing this, and like, do I want my kids weighing and measuring their food and counting macros? Hell no, right? That's not
Yeah.
what we want for anyone. Um, and you know, losing weight is, it's an uphill battle because our bodies don't want us to lose weight. So, maintaining significant weight loss is almost like a full-time job, right? It's
Mm.
You're fighting your body's biology. Human beings wouldn't be here, right, if we lost weight easily. Um, our bodies think it's a famine. They don't know it's CrossFit and counting macros, right? Her body thinks she's in danger, right? So um, it's going to be sending her every message to like, break out of this rigid routine. And so she's like probably having to double down. Like it takes a lot of energy to fight that biology.
Yes, it does.
Biology eats willpower for lunch, right?
Yes, it
So,
Mm-hmm.
does.
um, so I have a lot because I mean, this mom is like, this is intense, right? Now everybody has bodily autonomy. I'm not going to tell, someone else, how to eat, right? You know what your body needs. That being said, if you have to weigh and measure your food and count macros and work out a certain number of minutes to maintain a certain weight, you have to ask yourself, is this the weight my body wants to be, right? Or am I fighting nature in a way that, may not really be to my benefit? Um, so in terms of, in front of the kids, I think, if there were like a medical reason, like if somebody, let's say, if someone in your family has diabetes and you have to check your blood sugar and you have to know roughly like how many carbohydrates are in something to know how much insulin and how to combine foods, like there could be, you know, medical reasons why you have to be giving a little more attention to your food, right? Or if someone in your family has celiac, right? You would be reading labels and talking to restaurants in ways that weren't about diet culture, but they were truly about physical health. Um, when it's only about weight, I think it's really hard not to send mixed messages to your kids, right? So I think this mom is right to be, you know, um, concerned about that. It doesn't mean she's going to give her kids issues,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not. It doesn't not like an equation, right? Where like if you do this, then your kids will do that. Um, but it's if her kids are noticing it, yeah, it's having an effect. Um, the alternative is intuitive eating, where you learn to let go of those diet rules and learn and work on accepting whatever it is your body does when you're nourishing yourself. You know, in a way where you eventually don't have to even really think about it, right? You kind of you plan your grocery list and your meals, but you don't have to spend a lot of time, counting, planning, tracking on your Fitbit, all those kinds of things, and you can just like you have so much more time and energy to do the other things in your life.
How
Um,
intuitive is intuitive eating? Like, would somebody like myself or Diana need a dietitian to learn how to do that?
isn't it? It's funny, right? If we didn't have diet culture, it would just be called eating, right?
Yeah.
Um, like our ancestors didn't have to like read a book to know how to eat. Um, Intuitive eating, there are certified intuitive eating counselors out there, again, who are anti-diet, health at every size oriented. The Intuitive Eating book by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch came out with a new edition just this year. And it really takes you through, step by step. It's a process. So yeah, I mean, I think I feel for this mom. I think there's just so much pressure. And, when you do have significant weight loss, you get so much praise and everyone is so happy for you and your doctor and your
Yes.
family and you're buying clothes and maybe you can go into those stores you never could go into before and um, you can have almost like a euphoric feeling.
I really feel for her too because, and for my own, journey with anti-diet culture, it's a little different, when you're a person who goes from, I don't know, size 2 to a size 8. But when you stop weighing and measuring your food, or you have been a person who couldn't fit in an airplane seat, who now can fit in an airplane seat, and you have to run 15 miles a week and eat 1,000 calories a day to maintain being able to fit in an airplane seat, it is really scary to let that go.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So I feel like, there's this anti-diet idea, and f diets, and don't, you should be eating intuitively, et cetera, but when you become so large that it's hard to move in the world and function in the world, it's That's very, it's crippling. It's socially crippling, it's emotionally crippling. It's very hard. So I have a lot of compassion for this woman who is doing what she needs to do in order to keep her body in a place where it's easier to function in the world. And I happen to know who the person is. I know that she's not a stick, like she's not super super thin. Um, but she works very hard at staying where she is, and it's, and like you said, it is an uphill battle. So I feel for her.
Yeah, and
Diana,
I
yeah.
wish, yeah, yeah,
No, no, Diana, I also had a lot of compassion for another friend of yours who said that she lives in a family with, various sizes, but takes a very body neutral stance, right? She doesn't talk negatively about her body, but she has a partner who talks negatively about fat bodies and talks negatively about them in front of the children. So she was really curious about how to kind of going back to the whole mother versus father and how should dads, handle things. She's not sure how to support him with his internalized fat phobia and also kind of protecting the kids from absorbing it.
right. I know that's tough, and it, especially around the holidays. It maybe it's not your partner. It could be a a relative that says something, and you think, oh. But when it's your partner, your co-parent, or your spouse, it's really hard. I think again, always starting with compassion and curiosity. It makes sense that some look. You can watch the most progressive kind of left-wing leaning television show, and there will be fat jokes, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like the last acceptable prejudice, right? It's just terrible, and so it makes sense that people think it's okay to do that. Um, so I think for this, the spouse here, I would say something like, I'm really, eating disorders are on the rise. There's so much bullying, going on with body size. I would never want our kids to bully someone, about the way they look. And I don't want them to be at risk for having body image issues. Let's do everything we can to make our home body positive or body neutral. And so just kind of asking, like, why do you think that is? Why do we have these ideas about, body size? And what if our kids were in a larger body? How, you wouldn't want them to think you would make fun of them, right? So just again, approaching it not like, I listened to this new podcast and I'm going to like tell you how to talk to the kids, right? That's not going to go over very well. So I think more of a like, let's talk about this. Let's troubleshoot this. And also, parents can make, that rupture and repair, right? The joke might still happen or the comment, and that's the moment where, that day or even the next day, the dad can say, hey kids, you know what, I totally fell into this old habit of making, comments about people's bodies. I made a mistake and I'm really going to keep trying to do better. That makes a huge impact on kids, and it helps the adult kind of keep reinforcing whatever it is they're working on. So it's not like the bomb goes off and like you can't unring the bell, but you can go back and make repair and talk to your kids and show that you're human and you make mistakes.
I love that.
Yeah, me too.
Diana, you ready?
Yeah.
This is probably the hardest question, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the hardest question. But here we go. My biggest issue is what to do when my bottomless pit kid, who is medically considered overweight, constantly asks for more and more food. I usually offer him vegetables and he stops asking, but is that okay? Is it okay to limit his junk food snacks? I don't have a giant pile at home all the time, but we have a tortilla chips and salsa, goldfish, etc. He eats more than most members of the family, adults included. I'm kind of freaking out over what to do. We stay really active and I don't ever mention weight. I know 10 is the age when a lot of kids pack on weight before growing taller. My husband is relatively average size, maybe can stand to drop about 20 pounds, but I am definitely not. And obesity, this is what she wrote, so I'm just saying it. Obesity
That's
for
okay.
sure. Yeah, obesity for sure runs in my family.
So, do you limit what your children want to eat?
So the short answer is I would never try to restrict a child's food. Um, In fact, if there's sort of weight anxiety that's been sort of bubbling in the family, and he was maybe already a little on the bigger side, he could have been getting some restrictive messages like subtly over the years. And remember how restriction almost always leads to some kind of compensate, like some binging, right? So if there's been some restriction or he got the sense that he shouldn't have as much as he wanted, that can actually drive what looks like overeating when it's really just making up for kind of that scarcity. Um, Even if there wasn't actual scarcity, but there was sort of like the threat of scarcity, right? It's sort of like
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
people who even think about going on a diet start craving foods they don't even normally think about, right? So
Yep.
if somewhere in this family system this kid got the message that maybe he wouldn't be allowed to eat what he wanted, like that, again, that can be like a survival mechanism that kicks in. It's like you better eat as much as you can whenever you can. So I think it's really important for the family to kind of look at like what's the food culture and the body culture in our house. It sounds like they're already really trying to do all the right things. um, and she's exactly right. Age 10, this is like growth spurt time. Kids can gain 60, even 75 pounds as they, go into puberty, as their growth spurt is happening. Um, when we're worried about a kid's appetite, um, it's diet culture telling us that, right? That they must be doing something wrong. And so a parent, well-meaning, might start to restrict their child's food, and we know what's going to happen. It's only going to drive them to want to eat more, right? So whenever we try to interfere with our kids' natural instincts around food, it will backfire, right? So pushing food on a kid who's like a more selective eater will often make them want to eat less, right? Or you've like the skinny kid and you're worried about them growing. The more you pressure them to eat, the less they want to eat. Same, the kid you're worried about, he seems to be overdoing it. If you try to hold food back, it's only going to drive the things like you mentioned earlier, like hiding food, sneaking food, binging when they can. Um, so I think it's really important for this kid to feel like that food is available and that it's a range of foods, right? You don't want to suddenly have this like orthorexic pantry, right? Where it's only like quinoa chips and,
Mm.
like I think having those brands, like you mentioned, Goldfish or, Dorito, like the things that, teens and tweens like to have, having them, neutralizing them, that's actually going to help them develop a healthy relationship with those foods. Yeah.
Diana, we had questions from people about what we talked about a little bit about like some things our moms and stepmoms said to us. And people wanted to know, like, was there anything they could have said to you to prevent your eating disorder? And I personally don't think anything would have prevented my eating disorder. Certainly not something my mom or dad would have said. I think this was my fate. This was what I had to go through. That's my personal feeling about it. But one thing that I do think would have been a lot more helpful, would have been to get help a lot sooner because I ended up struggling with it for about 10 years before I got real help. And I don't blame my parents. They were immigrants. It was the 90s. This was before the internet. There just wasn't a lot of information about it. They didn't even know what it was for a few years. If there is a parent out there who really feels like their child has an eating disorder, what do you recommend the first step is that they should take?
Mm, that's a great question. There are some big organizations out there that, have kind of like quizzes and kind of quick evaluations. There's the National Eating Disorders Association. There's Feast, which is for caregivers of children with eating disorders. There's ANAD, ANAD. There are quite a few big organizations, but really, I think the first stop should always be the pediatrician. Right, so
Mm.
you can start doing your homework, but I wouldn't. Eating disorders have a lot of can have a lot of physical effects, and you also just the pediatrician is got to be on your team, right? Like that's the first stop. Um, and you want to make sure that obviously their weight is checked and all of their you know their blood pressure and all that kind of stuff is checked. And sometimes they'll even do blood tests. Now, a child can be very sick with an eating disorder, and all of their lab work can look amazing. So it doesn't mean, oh, then nothing's wrong. the pediatrician will help you find people in your area that can, evaluate and diagnose and get treatment going. I think the biggest thing is, kids should not be losing weight. Remember that awful thing where Weight Watchers had the special app for kids to
Oh,
to try to lose weight?
God.
And kids should not be losing weight. I think our culture has taught us that weight loss is always something to celebrate. And I think there's also this myth that after girls start their first period, that they're going to sort of lean out, quote unquote, a couple years later and lose their quote unquote baby fat. They might be growing taller, so their shape is changing, but kids and teens should not be losing weight. There's so many resources out there, and so many treatment approaches that are can be effective, and but definitely don't wait. Like you said, the longer it goes on, the longer your child is suffering. And one thing I just want to add too is I think we have this idea. This kind of goes back to one of your earlier questions about interrogating parents about the home life, or what interrogating you about, like, what did your parents do to you that led to this moment? There's such a myth in our culture that eating disorders always come from some deep psychological wound, or like dysfunctional family, or certainly people with eating disorders can have those kinds of things in their past. But what kicks off an eating disorder is the restriction, right? It's the energy deficit. So, all kinds of things can lead to that energy deficit. It doesn't have to even be a diet. Diets are the most common, right? So back to that mom whose, daughter wants to go on a diet. Like, diets are the single biggest risk factor for developing an eating disorder. And of course, we don't call them diets now. So it could be a cleanse, a detox, a Whole30, a shift to veganism suddenly, things like that.
Lifestyle.
Right, a lifestyle change.
Lifestyle
Exactly.
change. Yeah.
And so, someone with the genetic predisposition to an eating disorder can, make a small change in their diet, not even wanting to lose weight. It doesn't have to be driven by body image concerns. And they can slip into an eating disorder. The same thing can happen after, a surgery, a really bad stomach flu. I know a family where the middle school daughter, her soccer practices went from just Saturdays, AYSO kind of thing, or like twice a week, to like a real team that practiced 6 days a week and had games. And it was really intense. And she would come home exhausted and wouldn't eat dinner. She wasn't trying to skip dinner. She was just exhausted and was exerting so much energy out on that soccer field. She'd had to be hospitalized for anorexia. So, again, I think the myths in our culture about what eating disorders are all about can really help, can get in the way of families recognizing an issue. And it's, there's a neurobiological component to all of this. And I think it's really important to know that. And again, it all gets kicked off by restriction of some kind.
Oona, thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like we learned so much.
Yes, this was
amazing.
amazing.
I hope so. I love talking with you.
So for everybody out there, you can learn more about Oona on her website, www.oonahanson, OONAHANSON.com. And for lots of articles and other resources on this topic, check out her Facebook page. It's called Parenting Without Diet Culture. And she's also active on Twitter at Oona Hanson, OONAHANSON, and Instagram at Oona, OONA_HANSON.
Right, and guess what? We also have Instagram and Facebook. Yay! Welcome to the 2000s, the Hunger Trap Podcast. So please follow the Hunger Trap Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. We're hunger_trap_podcast on Instagram. If you have questions, comments, topics you'd like to hear about, we even have email. Welcome to the 90s. The Hunger Trap Podcast at gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you again, and thank you everybody for joining us. We'll see you next time.
All right, take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.